So let's get started with the webinar. But before I do that, let me just walk you through what we're going to be discussing today. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to start providing you with a little bit of historical background to understand what has led us to this moment. Second, we're going to be analyzing how support for the new constitution has been changing since Chile opened, I would say, this kind of warms back in 2019. And this, of course, will inform our view as to whether the constitution is going to be approved or rejected. We will then unpack some of the elements of the new constitution and think about how the new rules of the game could impact multinationals. And finally, we're going to be outlining some political and economic scenarios depending on what Chileans vote on Sunday. At the end, we're going to try to have 10 minutes of Q&A. So again, if you want to submit any question, you can do it now through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. And you can address your question to FrontierView webinar, or you can also do it at the end. So with this, let's just get straight into it. So my first question is, what led to the decision to rewrite Chile's constitution? And maybe we can start with you, Jill, and then Mariana.
Okay, thanks, Pablo. Well, the current 1980 constitution was left in place by the Pinochet dictatorship, which left office in 1990. There have been about 60 piecemeal reforms to the constitution since then, and primarily under Ricardo Lagos in 2005. The main reforms at that time were that the provisions for non-elected senators were eliminated, and the president's right to dismiss the commanders of the armed forces was reinstated. What wasn't touched was the binominal electoral system, which is still in place, which has meant that since 1990, two broad coalitions have continued to dominate presidential and legislative elections, which has really marginalized smaller parties and individual politicians. And I think it's been seen as limiting the representational capacity of Congress in particular. But I think before 2019, the Constitution wasn't a prominent voter concern. It wasn't seen as a principal issue for most people. It wasn't really considered Pinochet's constitution anymore after all the reforms that had taken place. It was only during the 2019 protests that it kind of came to symbolize and be blamed for the social inequalities that were a key factor in the unrest. I think inequality is the key issue here. Chile has been very successful at reducing poverty in recent decades, but not at reducing inequality. It's one of the most unequal countries in the region. It's the most unequal region in the world. And some of that does relate to provisions of the 1980 Constitution, which gave the state a subordinate role to the market in some economic areas, basically giving the private sector responsibility for provision of a lot of social goods such as pensions, healthcare, and education. This has had some positive results, such as increased access to higher education through creating private universities. But it's also produced inequalities of access, which were one of the key factors in the 2019 protests. There had already been protests over education in 2006 and 2011, and over pensions in 2016. All of these factors have been worsened in recent years by slowing growth, because strong growth and investment opportunities no longer paper over the cracks in the system to the extent that they did in the 1990s and early 2000s. But also, I think going back to the question of representation, trust in politicians and political institutions has been declining, and that has brought the 1980 Constitution more into focus for protesters.
Yeah, so if I had to summarize, it seems that there's still unmet social demands. It seems that Chile maybe didn't take full opportunity of the commodity super cycle, right, which ended in 2013, to really address that type of inequality. And 2019, it got to a point in which, many Chileans thought enough is enough. I don't know, Mariana, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would certainly echo Jill in saying that we didn't really see Chile's kind of impressive economic growth trajectory really trickled down evenly. So as I think you can see on the slide here on the left, Chile is among the wealthiest countries in LATAM, but it also has some of the highest income inequality. And that was a key driver of these protests. Now, if you've been following Chile, you remember the protests in 2019, but there was significant discontent with public services, particularly in education, for years and years before that, right? These weren't the first protests that we saw emerge in Chile, but they were the most destabilizing. And so when these protests emerged, the Piñera administration was left with thinking, well, how do we address these social demands? How do we compromise with the groups that are expressing discontent? And that's what kind of led to this effort to kick off a constitutional process and to really take on the structural issues that were plaguing Chile by addressing this, by updating this constitution, which is, as Jill mentioned, does very much symbolize the Pinochet era, despite having undergone quite significant reform since then.
Okay, and Jill, back to you. I mean, you already mentioned education and healthcare, but would you mind outlining what are the key topics that the new constitution is trying to address?
There are so many of them that it's actually quite hard to say in a way, but I think the key issues that have underlined social and political discontent are really the education and also the state health and pension systems. The current constitution protects people's right to choose between public or private social welfare providers, which has made it very difficult to establish a universal state health system or pension system. For example, Chileans can choose whether to contribute 7% of their salaries into the public health system or a private insurance fund, which takes money out of the National Health Service, and higher income individuals will go private. It also limits the prospects of setting up a universal system for all people. And in the case of education as well, there's been a huge disparity between educational attainment and socioeconomic groups, which essentially feeds into equality and cements inequality. People who complete tertiary education in Chile earn about 140% more than people who only complete secondary school, and people who complete university education are almost all from private schools and from higher economic groups. So the new constitution would be trying to eliminate the factors that have made obstacles to greater equality in pension, healthcare, and education access.
Got it. So it's not that the old constitution is broken, but it has not lived to its promise that access would be equal to all Chileans. That's what I'm reckoning from what you're saying. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And it's, as I said earlier, I think that's been made clearer because when growth was stronger, there was more money in the pension system, there was more money for healthcare. That pot's been shrinking now, and I think the disparities are becoming more evident.
Makes sense, makes total sense. And we can probably talk about the fiscal outlook of Chile. I don't know if we have time during today's webinar, but it's definitely something that we're tracking. So very helpful background. Thank you, both of you.
Hi, my name is Krista Reganey, and I'm Marketing Director here at FrontierView. I'd like to thank you for watching a segment of this webinar. If you'd like access to the full video and our latest insights, data, and research, sign up for a free trial with us today. Simply scan the QR code on the screen.